2021. We had several webinars in 2020 and a conference, and also this is going to be the first of many webinars that we're going to schedule for this year. Last year, all of the webinars and the conferences are now available for you to review. So let me just share my screen and then go over with the new and modernized center site. So if you see here, we have a conference site. And as a matter of fact, the next conference for the third annual conference on the art and science of business valuation is scheduled for December 7th through 9th. And the registration page and additional information will be available for that. This is the conference we just had in December, and all the recordings and the materials are also available for you. And this is the first conference we held in 2019. So the third conference is going to cover a broader topic in business valuation related disciplines. So we hope you'll join us. So it's almost the end of the year. And then the webinars, in our webinar site, we saved every single webinar we host, and you have access to the recordings and to the materials. So from the financial data analysis to the technical, operational, and management resilience of financial sector. So we have all webinars that were held. The recordings are there. We also have, if you are not familiar with this, this is Dr. DeSico's Corner, and he blogs every month on the current activities. So you may probably go back and then read and take part in the discussion. So this is also another place where you can get access to the blogging site. And what we are planning to do is in 2021, we are putting together a members corner where members can have exclusive access to all the due diligence and then the analysis tools, peer review journal articles, and of course, discount coupons for our trainings. And the final notice I have here is that the center has its signature certification program, which is ICVS-A in partnership with IACVS. So the training is going on. You can sign up for the live, virtual, and then the self-paced training. So that is the announcement for this morning. And now I'm going to introduce Dr. Joel DeSico, the co-founder of the Center for International Business Valuation and principal consultant. And he's the lead author for ICVS-A. And he is a frequent speaker at the webinar series here. And today he brought a very interesting topic, the environmental and social impact on valuation. So with that, I will give the podium to Dr. Joel. Joel can take it from here.
Okay, Dr. Devaja, thank you so much, and welcome everyone once again to our webinar series. And I'm glad to be here, and I want to mention that the topic that we're going to be doing today is one of the, if you think about the year 2020, many of you probably want to forget about 2020, but for the ones who, in business, that you have to be cognizant of 2020, the concept of environmental, social, and governance, is one of the top three terms you probably heard in the year 2020. 2020 represented COVID-19, it represented diversity and inclusion, and ESG. So if you had to mention three big terms that were used in 2020, those are it. And for valuation, This has taken a life of its own now. And I will be quite honest and tell you 5 years ago, if I was looking for this on valuation, I probably would find practically um, zero or maybe a handful of academic papers on this. Today, there's more resources on ESG, and that's the abbreviation we're going to be using for this, than you can believe. It seems like every journal that I look at is talking about ESG. And to prepare this PowerPoint presentation, I used a lot of sources that were really, really on target. And this will be the topic that's not a fad. This topic will be around for quite some time now. And as you can see from, weather conditions and how the environment is starting to be a part of the conversation every single day now, I think it's important that as evaluators, you consider this part of it. So, with that being said, and like I said, there's so many articles on this, and I thought it was really highly relevant to, quote some of the concepts that I seen already in these papers, and I double check sources and everything. But I just thought it was really interesting. One of the things they talked about was Alphabet, which is Google's parent, stated that rising temperatures can increase its cost of cooling its energy-hungry data centers. Yeah. Boohoo was linked to modern slavery, and as a result, its shares dropped immediately. The stock of Beyond Meat is skyrocketing as a result of the environmental damage of meat production. With social media um, out there today, and everyone has like an opinion, like they would say. I mean, anything that doesn't meet someone's expectations will immediately drive impact. Now, you think about GameStop, for instance, you can see the power of social media today. Someone says something on Reddit, and all of a sudden the stock price could go up 1,000%. So yes, it's in the interest of these organizations to take hold of ESG because it will impact their valuation. Now, I'm not talking about day-to-day pricing and trading. I'm talking about long term. And yes, it will impact the valuation in the long term. Um, so, ESG has become central themes and now for both investors and the users of capital. Both the corporations have to be cognizant of it because investors are demanding it. That's interesting. It's, the point about it is that investors are now looking at corporations and they're looking at what are they doing for ESG. It's no longer a it's nice to know, but now they demand to know, and that's a major difference than what it was just even a few years ago. And now you're going to see a lot of academic studies now being conducted in this area. I know, for instance, two people in this webinar right now are earning their doctorates, and their professors are really focusing them on how does ESG affect stock prices, for instance, or how does it affect bond prices? And now they just showed you a study by Morningstar. That's one of the ones that keep track of mutual funds mainly, but they do a whole lot more than that though. But they show that these funds have outperformed traditional funds over multiple time horizons. Now, so if in other words, if you're an ESG and you're really emphasizing that in your annuals and all that, they have suggested that they have these companies, these funds have outperformed the traditional. Now, me as being in academia and as well as in practice, I would tell you, there's some truth to that, but there are studies that will indicate the opposite. So I just want to be balanced here, you know. So, but yes, but there are some studies that are now suggesting that these companies that promote ESG have outperformed those that have not. And here's some of these interesting stats. Um, again, according to Morningstar, over a 10-year period ending in 2019, 59% of sustainable funds, that's the ESG type groups, across the categories considered beat their traditional counterparts. Now, C-suite management has begun to incorporate ESG considerations in their capital budgeting. Remember, capital budgeting is long-term investing. They have to incorporate ESG. And even when I teach now on corporate budgeting and capital budgeting, hey, I have to throw this in now because it is relevant. It is, and you're going to see that now they're developing metrics for this. Um, and in fact, they said 9 out of 10 companies in the S&P 500 produced sustainability reports in 2019. That's substantial. Like I said, if you go 5 years back, I doubt that you would have seen many of them have that. This is all a new phenomenon. And wait till you see some of the stats on bonds, which just really, which I'm going to get to, that's really blew me away how much money these bond issuances are just being issued just for ESG type projects. Um, but what's hindered everything is the lack of uniformity in disclosure practices. So, as a evaluator, how do you really consider this? How do you value this? How do you take this into consideration? So they're going to have some reliable ESG metrics that will be coming across. And yet, this is the area that is most being developed as we are speaking. And I'm going to show you some of them. And I have some sources that I listed in the back that you should take a look at for some information on this. Nick Anderson, in his article on IFRS standards and climate related disclosures, talk about there is a relationship between ESG and value creation. So there's the accounting board suggesting that. And now the CFA Institute has begun working on a voluntary global industry standard. But the problem that's been, now I'll get to that in a second, but here's another one. The European Financial Reporting Advisory Group has established a task force. So again, everyone's getting involved, but that could be a danger zone. And this is what has delayed, in my humble opinion, this is one of the reasons why these things were delayed, because there's so many groups out there trying to promote this that there's no uniform standard. And if there's no uniform standard, there's a problem. So really what's happening now is little by little, they're trying to collapse some of them and merge them into a major group. For example, in the field of accounting, there's this group now called the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. Doesn't that sound like IASB and FASB? The SASB, they call them. And they are now starting to develop some kind of metrics for financial reporting. And that's what they're doing. Now, the thing is, do we really need to have a separate board? Can it just be merged into FASB and IASB? Well, that's for another conversation and probably another webinar. But generally, they're on the thing. And what they're doing is something called the impact metrics. That's what they're developing. And that's going to be used in determining cost of equity or cost of capital, depending. So we'll talk about that a little bit later on as well. When people think about ESG, environmental, social governance, what do they think of? Oh, non-financial. And that's been true for many, many years. And if it's non-financial, how are you going to affect the valuation? Well, how can you do it? Well, they know that ultimately you're going to have some kind of financial metrics for it to have some meaning. Because again, like the third bullet says, does a corporation have a business model that faces threats from climate change? Are its social practices and policies optimized to attract and retain customers and human capital? Yeah, that's nice to know. You can say, oh yes, we have a threat. Well, how do you quantify that threat? That's the point. How do you measure it? And and one of the things I'm going to be quoting is Peter Drucker says, well, if you can't measure it, people will not consider it. So really what they used to say is, and now the new buzz term they use is something called pre-financial information. In other words, you need to have this information involved so we can build those into the financial statements. That's why it's called pre-financial, in the sense that once we know and once we can develop what these impact metrics are, we can start building it into the models. And again, there's, like I said to you, there's always academic studies. And like I said, some of the people attending this webinar are getting their doctorates and their professors are really pushing this. And for example, there's this article in the Journal of Portfolio Management, which is a highly regarded academic journal. And they have a topic called "In Foundations of ESG Investing, How ESG Affects Equity Valuation, Risk, and Performance." The authors concluded that ESG information positively impacted their valuation and performance through a lower cost of capital and higher valuation multiples. So you can see more and more, you're going to start seeing these kind of studies out there. But you don't want to be behind, you don't want to be the one standing behind while everyone else is considering this. So everyone is now on the bandwagon, like they said, and everyone's starting to develop these metrics. And it's for the good. I mean, we really should consider this. And like I said, but how would this affect them? And, one of the ways, as we all know, as evaluators, we look at things like, how is this going to affect the cash flows in the distant future? How do we adjust this stuff? It's going to affect the terminal value, what they call the terminal assumptions. Because think about it, if your company is going to be in an industry or has not adjusted to the changing climate, for instance, they may have a very short lifespan and therefore will greatly affect your terminal assumptions. And as an evaluator, you need to look at this stuff. Without any questions, you need to consider this. Because, hey, listen, if you're in an industry that's really greatly affected by ESG rules and you're doing absolutely zero about it, or you just, let it ride, well, that's going to affect, no longer you're going to use these, high, terminal growth rates of 2% to infinity, like they say. Now maybe, maybe not infinity, maybe an X amount of years and maybe at a 0.5% growth rate, if at any, maybe even negative. So yes, it's going to affect everything. So, and like we said, since terminal value can represent 70% of the value of an organization, hey, if you're not doing something to protect yourself in the long run, your company may be out of business. And as I said, the ESG is something that market participants want. It's not something that temporarily a fad, like I said earlier. You must. It's no longer optional to consider this in any kind of business valuation. And now when we do due diligence, ESG has to be asked now. ESG has to be asked. What are you doing for the environment? What kind of social are you doing for the globe? What kind of corporate governance do you have?
Hi, Joel.
What?
Hey, Joel. Sorry to interrupt you. That I saw a text or a chat from the panelist Hafiz, and he said that he actually published a paper on this article, and he gave us a link on that. So we're going to bring him to the panelist, group later on so that he can share with us. So this is a very interesting.
Super. Oh, absolutely. Good. No, that's really great because like I said to you, it's no longer optional. It is a requirement now. And when you do due diligence, for one to do due diligence, you have to ask this question now. You have to. And I'll show you how you could look at some of this stuff. Well, for example, one of the things is the market approach. Well, again, now when you're looking at the market, I mean, what we're doing here, everyone, is we're not changing the methods that we use to value. It's just the input's going to be different in terms of the numbers you're going to put in. The market approach is always going to be there. But the thing about it is, when we're using the ESG data now for when we do, for example, the market approach, for example, your company is highly proactive in ESG and you're doing comparables and your comparables are not so active, hey, you might want to make a change in that. but you could justify it now. Anytime you do, it's much of art as it is a science, but now you can say, well, we think our multiples should be slightly higher because we're proactive in ESG as opposed to our competitor. Well, that's something you can explain. But like I said to you, this is all part of due diligence. So again, you got to calibrate the market inputs to consider the effects of ESG. There's no doubt about that. And of course, the income approach where, how do we, like I mentioned earlier about the terminal value, are we going to lower it because of that? But, there's several approaches. What else is new, right? There's always more than one way of doing anything. But again, it just requires you to ask the question. It requires you to ask the question because the last thing you want is to say, why didn't you think about the ESG in the long run for this company? And I have some examples I want to show you in a bit. But who's responsible for all of this? It goes back to, it doesn't even have to be ESG for that matter. It goes back to the original question. Who's responsible for this? Is it management or is it you, the evaluator? Well, the burden, more and more of the burden is on the evaluator, but it's management still responsible for it though. And it's no different than when you're doing an audit. For example, there's no different than the same concept of a going concern. This relates to going concern in many respects. Going concern means, is your business going to last for a while in layman's terms? Well, this is really what we're asking. I mean, this is the question. The auditors have to have metrics to measure it, but it's still, management has to answer these questions for the auditor. No different than it is in valuation. In valuation is the burden is on the evaluator to ask the questions, but management has to provide the information though. So if the evaluator will be negligent if they're not asking those questions about ESG. Now, the thing about this, like anything else, is like for individuals, like say Bob Brackett, was on our panel, who have done valuations, forever. He knows about ideas of concepts of premiums and discounts where you got to worry about double dipping and triple dipping. Well, the same thing goes here. Yes, you want to, you want to import ESG factors into the valuation. However, though, you don't want to be, charged with double dipping or triple dipping by putting in things whereby I'm affecting my cost of capital and I'm also adjusting my cash flows and I'm also taking a discount. You got to be careful that you're not double counting. And that's the point you got to be aware of. Be very careful if you're going to be double counting these things. So you have to think it out. I'm not saying don't do ESG. I'm saying you have to make sure you're not double, triple dipping, like they say. And here's another interesting stat, like I was talking about bonds. According to Moody's, as of 2020, there have been 425 billion in sustainability bond issuances in the last decade alone, as opposed to 1 billion a decade ago. Look at this, 425 billion. So I guess if you're a corporation and you want to raise money through debt, just say it's for sustainability and you're going to get it. And this is, like I said to you, this is a big impact. And look at this number, it's staggering. 6% of global debt issuances in the third quarter alone were sustainability bond issuances. 6% of global debt in the third quarter of 2020 alone were sustainable bond issuances. It's amazing, isn't it? Like I said to you, just ask 5 years ago how much of this you have seen, right? It's just amazing how the economy and how everything changes so fluidly now. It's just amazing. I just find it amazing. These numbers are staggering, absolutely staggering. And as I mentioned earlier, if you cannot measure it, you cannot improve it. That's Peter Drucker, the guru in management theory. And that's true. You know, if you can't measure it, how are you going to improve it? And like I will go back, if you can't measure it, how are you going to put it into your valuation at the same token? How you measure it? So if you can't measure it, how are you going to put it into the thing other than making a wild guess, you know, as to how you're going to affect your valuation? Again, but this is good because now the momentum is in this field. It's, there's a movement now to measure all this. And now more and more you're seeing organizations, these professional organizations coming up with metrics. Like you can see things like MSCI, PRI, and all of these groups are now just out there today, just coming up with new metrics. And now here, for example, some studies suggest that big time ESG programs generate lower cost of capital. And this is from MSCI. And, and other studies, though, like from Vanguard in 2020, might indicate otherwise. So like I said to you, in academia, one thing you'll appreciate or get frustrated at is that if you want to find something that supports your opinion, you can find it. There's enough out there today, but I mean, like I said, it's too new to really give you an evaluator a definitive answer. It's going to be based upon the company itself, like any valuation. Some companies run themselves better than others, but generally the momentum is, the thought is that it's going to, enhance the value of a company. Now, and another thing I want you to notice is that all these studies I'm quoting are from 2019, 2020, 2021. You can see the currency of these articles. A lot of times you're doing a research paper, you're finding articles that can be 10, 20 years old, and even older sometimes. But here, I mean, most of the stuff you're going to find are very current, because this is a hot topic today. And, there's still a lack of commonly accepted approaches to measure the financial impact. But it's going to get there. It's going to get there eventually. Just like when we had this COVID crisis, you got the big farmers going after it. And it's just a matter of time before they spend all their brain power and artificial intelligence behind it. Eventually they'll find something. Well, same thing here. I mean, everyone is spending their time on this now. You're going to come up with some metrics. And I think once we have a uniform standard of how do you report this thing, then the metrics become easy because then we know how to report it. But the thing is, when you have too many groups out there, like I said in the beginning, it makes it very difficult. Now some of this stuff I have is coming from MSCI or KPMG. KPMG just came out with an incredible article in 2021 that talked about this, which I cited in the back. But, here's the typical kind of question you get. Should we adjust the discount rate or the cash flows, right? Should we increase the discount rate if you're not doing it or adjust the cash flows? How do you want to handle it? Just be careful. You don't want to double dip, like I said. Sometimes you want to do both, but I don't know. That may be, double dipping, like I said. So here's an example by KPMG. And I really like this slide. I think they really did a good job on this. And again, they didn't give you any answers. They just gave you an idea, thought, how one best can attempt to handle this. And look what they did. They come up with free cash flow. You see, there's no such thing as changing terminology. Just free cash flow, but they call it ESG because they're saying after considering the ESG impact, what's our cash flow? So they started off with their revenue, but then they decided to decrease $200 in operational revenues. Why? Due to social. What? Anyone have a question?
No, I think someone sneezed it, so go ahead.
Oh, okay. Okay. Due to social backlash and a bad reputation caused by poor employee work conditions. Well, that's the S factor, the social factor. They deducted $200 for that. Well, then you got your revenues, you got your operational costs, operational taxes, and then you have um, additional tax penalty due to fines imposed by regulatory authorities. That's governance. Where was your corporate governance? And then they said, well, there's this new kind of concept of this 2-degree scenario. Additional investments to mitigate the impact of the 2-degree scenario. So they said, look at what our additional capex is, 50, and that's due to the environment. And now we come up with an additional cash flow. What a wonderful approach this is. They did not adjust the cost of capital. They just adjusted the cash flows, which is fine. This is the more detailed way of doing it than just adjusting the cost of capital. But like they said, you could do it either way. Just be careful if you're going to double dip. That's the main thing. But I like this approach that KPMG did. So I just thought it was really interesting to show you. And I like how they were able to show you the factors involved. Now here's an example that KPMG also mentioned about double dipping. And this I found really good. The auto industry is greatly affected by ESG due to the emergence of electric cars. As a result, the beta would increase industry-wide. In other words, it's going to be much more volatile. Beta, that's part of the CAPM model, will be much more volatile. Therefore, any resulting downward forecast of cash flow might have already been incorporated in the industry data. This is excellent. This is what we're talking about, the double dipping. You've got to be careful. If you're going to be using a higher beta because of this, be careful because you already incorporated that changes in the cash flows. So like I said, this is an important example to be careful. We're so easily, want to, make adjustments for all these things, but you've got to be careful, okay? Another one. You should also incorporate sensitivity analysis. We all do that. All of us, as valuators, we all do sensitivity analysis, what ifs. So here's another way that KPMG did this by showing you scenario 1 and scenario 2. And scenario 1, what they said is, let's take 50% saying we're going to change all of the factors we talked about here. All the factors that we talked about. This one. Let's assume we're going to have to consider all of them. So that's 50%. And then the other one would be, just consider the 2-degree scenario, the CapEx, that we assume this is the only one that we're going to consider. And that's 50%. So you see, this is how they come up with the weighted average valuation. It's a weighted average. They're not saying let's do that scenario. Let's just say, in other words, let's just say, take out the $200 for that one, take out the $40, and then just keep the $50 in there. That would be the valuation, right? That's the cash flow. So that's the other approach in which they want to consider. But like I said, there's so many different ways one can look at it. And I have other ways too I want to show you. No, but like I said, when we're doing ESG, we always think of it in terms of qualitative nature. But you also have financial forecasting, which we talked about, whereby you have to be able to consider the impact. Now, KPMG did that example where they showed you, about the automobile industry and how electric cars could affect their revenues. Well, they showed you some other examples as well, in which I want to show you. For example, the forecast revenues. Now, you should be able to incorporate some of these things in industries. For example, the sales and growth rate could be affected, right? Well, let's do an example. rising obesity could be a revenue driver for retailers in health, wellness, and diet products, resulting in increased sales by X percentage over the next 5 years. I could tell you that there's a professor at Florida Atlantic who, and some of you might know who I'm talking about. There's a professor out there who really was on the vegan, um, was on this vegan thought, really big time vegan, and he opened up this national chain for vegan stores and beauty supplies and all of that stuff. But that's part of that, and you can say the growth rate for this vegan industry is growing because of, again, ESG. Now, that's one of the things. Like, here's an example of obesity. You can also talk about veganism. I know my brother-in-law, oh my goodness, they are extreme vegans. And I'm like, I don't know how they eat it, but that's another that's for another conversation. But veganism is a prime example of that. So, like I said, you might want to increase sales at a higher rate because that's where the momentum is on. Like I said, to all the plant-based foods, beyond meat and all of that stuff. Right, by income statement adjustments. For example, chemical companies operating cost estimates may be increased by X dollars a year for dealing with new legislation on toxic waste. Yeah, like I said, man, there's a whole lot of stuff you got to consider. You just can't. And here's the thing, especially when you're dealing with the smaller companies that you may do evaluations of, they may have no idea about considering these things. And it's not a criticism. It's just that you as an evaluator should be one that helps them along, like you do in any kind of engagement. You should be asking them these questions. Because as an evaluator, the way I look at this is that you're also a consultant when you do this, engagements. I mean, you should be able to advise them as to, hey, are you considering ESG? Like I said, it's no longer just something that is optional. It is mandatory now. Okay. And you can have things like balance sheet adjustments, forcing closures of certain type of operations for you. For example, a company's cash flow from a mining company's coal assets may be significantly less in the future due to insufficient demand or regulatory change. So you may have that as well. So again, they may not be thinking about what may be happening 5, 10 years from now, whereas large corporations have their lobbyists. They know where it's going. They know where things are heading. So like I said to you, it's something to think about when you're doing evaluation. Cash flow adjustment, CapEx, as we talked about earlier, legislative changes could force an electricity producer to upgrade its coal power plants to meet new environmental regs. The list could go on and on and on and on. Again, be aware of this. Terminal values could be changed, as I mentioned earlier. Like, for example, in the oil and gas industry, that may be a dead industry 50 years from now, or 30 years from now. So are you going to use a high terminal growth rate for this industry? Maybe 20 years ago you would have, or even 10 years ago you would have. But now things may be changing. And in the meantime, you can write down some of their assets. So like I said to you, there's so many ways you can do this. But the main idea is do not double dip, triple dip. And like I will say these things when we're doing discounts all day long, we're doing premiums and discounts. Be careful about double dipping. This is one area that could lead you to that. Scenario analysis I talked about. You should always have a baseline, and you can always have one that's optimistic, pessimistic, and the base. So we want to see what the materiality of those ESG factors are. Now, this one is another approach. And I thought this was also something that you might be seeing a lot more later on because it's another way of looking at it. This is coming from PRI and also also MSCI, and all these acronyms. And look what they do. We know about the weighted cost of capital. What about the weighted average cost of all capital? All capital. Yeah. This one now, we talk about adding, this is the traditional balance sheet. You got the fixed assets and the current assets and equities and liabilities. But what about human resources? What about societal resources? What about natural capital on the asset side? And what about this on the liability equity side? What about them? Do we consider, this is something we used to talk about quite a bit when we're talking about intangibles. Now we could probably bridge intangibles with ESG a whole lot more, because these are things where we used to talk about expertise, motivation, loyalty, team spirit, societal resources, property rights, freedom, license to operate, infrastructure, natural capital, industrial site cleanup, water preservation, right? And on the liability trial, training expenses, severance pays, regulatory compliance, lobbying, as I mentioned earlier. And you notice these things, a lot of these things are not on the balance sheet, as we know, because they're intangibles, self-generated intangibles. But now, all of a sudden, they're saying, hey, maybe it shouldn't be just self-generated. Maybe they should affect the company somehow. Now, again, finance is not accounting. Accounting will probably still not have these on the book, but you never know. I mean, you got the Sustainability Accounting Standards Boards out there, and they may start promulgating rules saying that for our accounting reporting, we need to throw these things in. But who knows? And it's like I said, this is no way going to happen yet, but you never know. I mean, you may have another set of records, one for the investors that has both the traditional FASB, IASB statements, and maybe one that's SASB statements. But who knows? I don't have a crystal ball, but I can tell you maybe that might be something that might be happening in the near future. But anyways, the big idea is for now in the finance realm of it, instead of having something called the weighted average cost of capital, you have the weighted average cost of all capital. And what this article showed me was really something very interesting, and that how when they're coming up with the weighted average cost of all capital, they consider human resources, they consider the N, which is the natural capital, the human resources, the societal resources, and they're all coming up to come up with some kind of cost of capital. And here, as you can see, the adjusted cost of equity has one of the things that different is, this is the CAPM model. This is what I call the adjusted CAPM, because you have the risk-free rate, which is the traditional one, but also what you're going to have is this thing called RS. And RS is the profitability required for the sector by investors in light of specific risks. In other words, the ESG risk, and so forth. You're going to have a different type of beta, BS, beta subscript S. Yeah, you're going to have a whole different model in the near future. And only time will tell how much this is used, but believe me, this one article that I really suggest you take a look at must have provided at least 25 different examples of how you could try to measure the impact of ESG. Now, for example, now the SASB, another one I got to remember, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, and PR, they're all working in conjunction. And what they did is, in this case study, what they suggested was, what are some of the 35 key issues that you should be aware of? There's 10 themes, 3 pillars. Each pillar gets, like I said, it could be an impact. 10 themes, like for example, on the environment, climate change, natural capital, pollution and waste, environmental opportunity, blah, 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 social, human capital. And they listed the incremental issues. Climate change, issues such as carbon emission, product carbon footprint, climate change vulnerability, pollution and waste, electric waste, toxic emissions, social. All of these things come into play. So now, when you're doing your due diligence, These are the kind of questions you're going to ask. And this is how you come up with what you think should be adjustments to those traditional cash flows, or change your cost of capital to all capital, right? So these are some of the things that you should be thinking about. This is what SASB is doing already, so be on the lookout. They're already ahead of the game. They're building this. Corporate behavior, your tax transparency, all these are going to be rated a score. And here, and you can see this is from MSCI ESG rating, again, 2020, all very current stuff. And you can see the raw data. What's the raw data? These are your raw data. This is your raw data. And then you're going to get a score. You're going to get a score on social. You're going to get a score on governance. And then, you're going to bring them all up, and then you're going to weight them. And you're going to get a final industry score. You're going to get a final industry score from 0 to 10. And what does that mean? There's your letter rating. There's my final score. And then you're deemed the leader. This category. This is like bond ratings, right? This is how, and now the next step, ultimately, the next step, where it's still being worked on, but it's almost around, and that probably they are, you could convert these into rates. And it's going to differ depending upon the industry. But that's what's going to be coming. You see how we're getting there. We're taking small steps forward, but we're going to take these numbers, and probably academia has already done this. I haven't seen it, but it's probably going to be close. They're going to convert them into rates or adjustments to your cash flows. That's the next step. But this is what they're doing. This is what they're doing now. So you can see we're right around the corner on really trying to quantify this entire process. And like I said to you, these are the sources I use, and they're just absolutely excellent sources of information on these things. And again, if anyone wants the details, I can send it to you in email. But these are some of the sources, and it's like I said to you, this is not a fad. This is something that's going to be here for a very, very long time, if not permanently, because again, it's going to impact. So you as evaluators really need to take note of this. And even if you're not at this point making adjustments for it, you should at least address it. Just like, for example, when you're doing a valuation report, you got to address the asset method. Even though you might not be using the asset method, you still need to address it. You still need to address ESG. ESG needs to be addressed today. And that's going to be part of your due diligence. So that's my little presentation. We only had an hour to do this, but like I said to you, this should whet your appetite. And this is just the beginning. It's not the end. It's really just the beginning of how we go about dealing with evaluation. Okay, Deraja.
All right. Thank you so much, Joel. This is a very interesting session, even though, the good chunk of this concept is just went over me, because it's, this is not my area of expertise. But while you are presenting, I was chatting with the participant, and interestingly, Dr. Ahmed he's been doing his research in business valuation, and he is located I think in Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates. So I invited him to become a panelist. So Dr. Ahmed, do you have like 1 or 2 minutes on this topic, and then what you are doing?
Oh, I'd love to hear this. Yeah.
So your mic is on, and you can go ahead and then just give us what the summary of what you've been doing so far.
Are you talking to me?
Yes.
Sorry,
sir.
I was on a phone call, so I came back now. Yes.
Okay. So no, I was telling Dr. Joel that while he's presenting, I was communicating with you, and then we learned that you have an extensive experience on this area, and then you just published a paper on ESG. So, do you mind if you share maybe like 1 or 2 minutes of what you're doing, and then how you see the connection of what you're doing with Dr. Joel's presentation? And eventually, we want to link up with you to see if this can be an opportunity for us to partner doing similar activities in the future.
First of all, thank you very much, everybody, for looking at my paper, and thank you very much for this nice presentation on ESG, which was very pointed. And talking about my work, actually I started working on this topic in 2018, and first paper I published, and it was that you see that doing good by doing better. You see, it's doing better by doing good, discussing the value of selected just companies. So what I did, I read an article published in the Forbes in, I think it was in 2009, 18 or 19. So just I tried to capture the value potential of these ESG metrics. So what I did actually, I took a model, very famous model from the literature, Olson model, and I tried to capture the value potential of these companies, and then surprisingly, I got very nice results that you can see in my paper. You see, and it's a kind of market approach that I took, and over the period of time, we see that the companies who are following the best practices in the industry, in the industry, best practice of ESG, they have, the ESG has an impact on their value, on their market price. So we can easily see that impact.
Now that's excellent.
Yeah. In a nutshell, this was my research for this paper. Yeah.
Okay, that's
Yeah.
that's
And actually what I'm planning to do is, you see that because as a evaluator, we are normally, focusing on closely held companies. This was the first paper that I wrote for, the publicly, listed companies. It was covering listed companies. As today's presentation, we were talking about some metrics. So I was looking for to develop some same kind of metrics for the closely held companies, and so that we can incorporate this body of knowledge while evaluating, closely held companies for all our colleagues.
okay. George, what do you think?
What can I say? He's ahead of all. Yeah, that's exactly. I'm telling you, this is exactly what you be doing, getting those metrics. This is excellent.
It's
This is excellent stuff.
it's small world. So Bob,
No, I'm telling you. I mean, this is global issue. It's a global issue.
Yeah.
I know. Hey Bob, do you have any suggestions or any feedback on the presentations, and then just know what we've learned from Dr. Ahmed? And for that matter, I see also Moses is also on. He's from Nairobi. Any one of you guys can ask question or can chip in with what's going on.
This is Bob Brackett. It's still kind of at the stage, I think, for private businesses where Joel was talking. It's things that there are certain companies where it's more important, and a lot of other ones where it's not so much. But with a lot of the business valuations being done globally, it's either support of financial valuations or merger and acquisition work. And in both of those, I think I have to agree with Joel that in the last 2 to 3 years, it has just exploded in importance in both the financial reporting and the investment community, of the awareness of the business to these issues. And not so much that it's an on-off switch, it's either 100% impact or none, but at the very least, it has to be strongly considered, and decisions made as to whether you want to place that impact, because there is some, in the cash flow, or in the risk. At least one of those two places you need to have some impact. There's so many subjective things that you have to consider in business valuation, and they're so fluid. Just between two companies in the same industry, it can be huge difference between them. So you have to consider it. 4 years ago, one of the big things that you had to consider, but there may not have been a good way to measure, was digital security. And this environmental issue is right up there with that. And we don't have a good, widely accepted way to reflect this, but you better be considering it and making some decisions as to, is this 100% impact on their cash flow or risk, or is it a fairly small one based on what you're seeing in the industry, as well as the general economic region they're in. It's you have to consider it, I guess. I'll leave it there.
I think I have to, like I said, like in due diligence, you should at least address it, and you may just let it go. If it's a small company, it may not have a major impact, but at least it shows the valuator that you are on, you're not coming a laggard, that you're on top of what's going on out there.
Dr. Joel, I would like to add one point. I think we are, heading towards some kind of metrics that where we can attach some kind of weightage that we take into account what value a company. That weightage include, that is special weightage, keeping the size of the company, keeping the nature of the industry, or something we are heading, like we have beta, calculated betas are available. So this kind of thing we are going to have, I think, in the future.
Oh, absolutely. We have to, because like I said, like where I left off, you got the AAA, we got the, AAA rating. Okay, well, what does that translate to? I think it's going to go by industry. I think the group, the SASB, they're starting to do something like that. They're breaking it down by industry, and I think it's only a matter of time. But yeah, that's exactly right.
I think, Dr. Joel, I think we should, as a evaluators, I think we should try to develop some kind of database, that cover the globe. It will help a lot. It can be a very good thing for evaluators, especially for
Oh,
evaluating closely held companies.
absolutely, absolutely.
I think that is one of the reasons for the center to organize this type of webinars, because we want to connect to the minds of other professionals to make sure that we are promoting the language of business valuation across the board. Whether it's in Asia, we have participants from China, from Malaysia, from Singapore, Africa, the United States. So this is pretty much an international, a global movement. So that's why we want to have folks to join the center site, to join in these webinars, and even conferences. So we will be working to expand the knowledge, and also not only this webinars and seminars, we also have a professional training, the only training in business valuation in the world, which is the advanced financial instrument that Bob and Joel they kind of put together their energy to develop. And then we also have the first master's program in business valuation from Florida University Southeast. And the School of Business Valuation, Investment, and Real Estate has already built a comprehensive 18 months online program to give professionals an opportunity to earn their professional degrees in business valuation. And I think a good chunk of this, what you guys are discussing is also covered on the course, right, Dr. John? John is an advisor.
Well, I tell you in the, I think ESG has to be one of the newer topics that are being incorporated. It has to. Again, these things are so fluid that you don't know how fast it grows. But yeah, this is something that needs to be thrown in now by far.
All right. Okay. So we promised 1 hour, and we don't want to take your time, but because for some of you it's almost bedtime, and for some of you it's about still early in the morning. I think Bob, it's about what 6 a.m. in your time in Seattle. So if there is no question, I am checking the chat box. I'm checking the Q&A box. And so what we did different this time from the previous session is that we are actually broadcasting this webinar directly through the Facebook. And then we're also broadcasting through our webinar press, where you got the link for that. So, for this work, I thank Abenezer and Besagao and then their IT team in Addis. And so if there is no question, I think the next webinar is going to be in a few months. So we're going to share that information. And we'll also keep on sending you additional materials. And I think someone asked me how can they get this recording? So like what I showed earlier, all recordings from our webinars, our conferences are going to be available on the center side. If you become a member, you're going to get even more information, access to our peer-reviewed journal articles, and access to the tools and techniques that we are developing currently. Currently, we are developing two products. Joel, you want to share a little bit about the Python calculator and then the due diligence materials that we are working on. And eventually, when we are done, we will make that available to you through our member portal.
Yeah, well, one of the first things we're doing is on the center website, we're going to have for members, the Python calculator, where it actually will go over, you have issues on how do you value an interest rate swap, or how do you value a credit default swap or a futures contract by using Python. That's one of the things that we're going to be teaching, because part of the training program is to teach you how to use Python. And I tell you, it's a lifelong learning. A few years ago, talking about things change quickly. A few years ago, I didn't know anything about Python. Now, like every spare moment I have, which is not that much now, but I go on and I teach myself Python. I've been certified and I've been training constantly, because that's the method that evaluators should use for advanced financial instrument valuations. And even for routine statistics, we should use Python. And the other thing we had was a ramping of a due diligence platform where for evaluators to use it. For example, we talked about ESG. Well, ESG will be incorporated into the due diligence platform, and that should be ready in a few months.
Okay.
For members, when they want to do evaluation, it can be used two ways. One, as a check to make sure that you didn't forget to do something, and two, if you're reviewing evaluation, it's a good way to rate it.
Thank you. And lastly, we are also, we just published the first white paper and alternative analysis on the certification program, the International Certified Valuation Specialist with Advanced Financial Instrument. That's our signature work. And this is pretty much, Dr. Joel put together. This is to give the new folks who wanted to learn about the product. And we also built an alternative analysis with similar product on the CFA and how this product is different. And this is also, there is a good literature review body that shows that the need for having the advanced financial instrument knowledge throughout the world, because we are maybe at the verge of another financial meltdown. And so the question we have here is that if you see this site, which I'm going to share quickly with the center site, and it says, is the world ready for another financial meltdown? So that is where we're trying to build. And so you may probably get all this information from the site. And I think I'm hearing myself. So I think with that, if there's no other question, I will probably end the session here. Thank you so much for attending, Dr. Joel, as usual. Thank you for your selfless approach to share your knowledge on valuation discipline. And thank you, Bob and Dr. Hamid, for chipping in and contributing. So we will see you at the next webinar, and enjoy the rest of the day. And good morning, good day, good evening.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you.